Ngozi Kayamika's wedding day had finally arrived, and the entire town seemed to hold its breath. The church was decorated with fresh white lilies, the air filled with the sweet scent of celebration. Family members, childhood friends, and important community figures filled every seat, all eager to witness the union between Ngozi and Ikenna Obiora, the kind-hearted and respected doctor everyone admired. Cameras flashed as the radiant bride walked down the aisle, her white gown shimmering under the soft light. Ikenna stood tall at the altar, his eyes never leaving her, a proud smile on his face. The ceremony began smoothly, the priest's voice echoing warmly through the church. But as the vows approached, something changed in Ngozi's expression. Her bright smile faded. She blinked rapidly, her breaths becoming shallow. Guests exchanged curious glances, unsure if it was nerves or something more. The priest continued, but tension quietly filled the room. When Ikenna softly said, "I do," Ngozi's eyes hardened. Without warning, she raised her hand and struck him across the face. A sharp gasp erupted from the crowd, some even standing in shock. The priest froze mid-sentence, and Ikenna's stunned silence only deepened the suspense. With trembling lips, Ngozi's voice rang out, "You think I don't know what you did last night?" Murmurs spread like wildfire, whispers of betrayal reaching every corner. Yet Ikenna didn't lash out. Instead, he took a steady breath and said gently, "Ngozi, please, let me explain." He revealed that he had left his bachelor party early, not for another woman, but to visit her younger brother in the hospital, who had been in critical condition. He kept it secret to spare her from panic on her big day. The truth shattered Ngozi's anger. She had overheard a bridesmaid say, "He spent the night with someone," never realizing it was the nurse caring for her brother. Realizing her mistake, she broke down in tears. Ikenna lifted her, holding her hands as he vowed, "I'm not marrying you for a perfect day, Ngozi. I'm marrying you for a lifetime, even through misunderstandings." Tears filled the church, and as they exchanged rings, applause thundered. Love had won. The ceremony had begun beautifully, the choir's soft voices filling the air, but as the priest started the vows, something shifted. Ngozi's radiant smile slowly disappeared, her lips pressing into a thin line. She tried to focus on the priest's words, but her eyes kept drifting to Ikenna, searching his face as if trying to read a hidden truth. Her chest rose and fell faster, her breaths uneven. A faint tremble touched her hands, which clutched the bouquet tightly. At first, the guests thought it was wedding nerves. A few exchanged knowing smiles, whispering about how overwhelming the moment must be for a bride. But there was something different in her gaze, not the teary joy they expected, but a sharp, piercing look filled with confusion and hurt. The priest continued, oblivious to the growing tension, his voice warm and steady. Ikenna stood calm, unaware of the storm building in her heart. But Ngozi's mind was racing, words she had overheard earlier echoing like thunder. He spent the night with someone. She had tried to push it aside all morning, convincing herself it was a silly rumor. Yet now, standing before the man she was about to marry, the doubt clawed at her chest. A woman in the front row leaned toward her neighbor, whispering, "Is she okay?" A man in the back frowned, sensing something wasn't right. The soft rustle of clothes and murmured voices filled the church as people exchanged glances. Ngozi's breathing quickened. Every word from the priest seemed to fade under the pounding of her heartbeat. She could feel the eyes of every guest on her, waiting for her smile to return, but it didn't. She shifted slightly, her shoulders stiff, her gaze locked on Ikenna with an intensity that made him blink in surprise. The air in the room seemed heavier now, the earlier joy replaced with uneasy silence. No one knew what had caused the sudden change, but one thing was clear. Something unspoken had crept between the bride and groom, and it was only moments away from shattering the perfect wedding everyone had imagined. The moment had come. The priest's voice was calm and steady as he asked the groom to take his vows. Ikenna looked into Ngozi's eyes, his smile warm and certain. "I do," he said with quiet confidence. But before the joy of his words could settle, a sharp sound broke the air, the sound of skin meeting skin. Ngozi's hand had flown up and struck Ikenna across the face. The slap was quick, hard, and filled with emotion. The entire church froze in disbelief. The sound echoed through the hall, bouncing off the high walls and silencing even the smallest whisper. For a moment, no one breathed. Gasps rose from the crowd, sharp and loud, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Some guests stood in shock, their eyes wide, while others covered their mouths in disbelief. The choir stopped mid-note. The priest, holding his book in midair, stood completely still, unable to process what had just happened. Ikenna didn't speak. He didn't move. His eyes stayed on Ngozi, confusion and hurt flashing across his face. A faint red mark was already forming on his cheek, but he didn't raise a hand to touch it. He simply stared at her, as if silently asking why. From the back of the church, someone whispered too loudly, "Did she just?" Another voice cut in, "At the altar?" The tension grew heavier, filling every corner. Ngozi's chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes locked on Ikenna with a mix of anger and pain. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing yet. The silence between them was louder than any shout. Every guest could feel that something bigger was behind this, something that had nothing to do with wedding nerves. And as the seconds passed, the beauty of the ceremony crumbled into chaos. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone knew they were about to witness the most unforgettable moment in the history of weddings in Enugu. The sting of the slap still hung in the air when Ngozi's voice cut through the heavy silence. Her eyes glistened with tears, her lips trembling as she spoke, but her tone was sharp enough to pierce the heart of every person present. "You think I don't know what you did last night," she said, loud enough for the entire church to hear. The words hit harder than the slap. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by a wave of hushed murmurs. People shifted in their seats, leaning toward each other to whisper. The joyful atmosphere from minutes earlier had completely vanished, replaced with a tense curiosity and the sour scent of scandal. Some guests turned to stare at Ikenna with narrowed eyes, disgust flashing in their expressions as if they had just discovered a terrible truth. Others looked between the couple in confusion, their brows furrowed, desperate to understand what could have happened to bring the wedding to this moment. The priest lowered his hands slowly, his mouth slightly open, unsure whether to intervene or let the drama unfold. Ikenna's face remained calm, though a flicker of shock passed through his eyes. He stood tall, not looking away from Ngozi, but the redness on his cheek and the heaviness in the room made him seem suddenly smaller. From the back row, a woman whispered to her friend, "Did he cheat on her?" Another man muttered, "Last night? On the eve of the wedding?" These whispers only fueled the tension. The choir members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to stay seated or quietly leave. Ngozi's breathing grew faster, her shoulders rising and falling as if every word she had held inside for hours was about to spill out. The bouquet in her hand trembled, petals shaking under her grip. The church had become a pressure cooker of emotions, anger, shame, disbelief, and every eye was locked on the couple at the altar. No one knew the truth yet, but in that moment, every person in the room understood one thing. This was no longer just a wedding. It was the unraveling of love, right before their eyes. The weight of Ngozi's accusation lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. All eyes were on Ikenna, waiting for him to lash out, deny it, or demand an explanation. But instead, he stood perfectly still, his gaze locked on hers. He drew in a slow, steady breath, as if gathering his thoughts in the middle of a storm. "Ngozi, please, let me explain," he said softly. His voice was calm, steady, and without anger. It wasn't the reaction anyone expected. The crowd, already hanging on every moment, seemed to lean forward, curious about what could possibly come next. His tone carried no defensiveness, no attempt to argue. It was the voice of someone who wanted to be understood, not someone desperate to prove themselves innocent. This only made the guests whisper louder. Why wasn't he denying it outright? Why wasn't he fighting back? From the second row, an elderly woman shook her head, murmuring, "If it's not true, why is he so calm?" Others exchanged glances, wondering if this was his way of avoiding more shame. Ngozi's chest rose and fell quickly, her eyes wet but unblinking, as though daring him to continue. She expected a heated response, maybe even a desperate plea, but instead, his composure unsettled her. The priest looked from one to the other, his lips pressed into a thin line, clearly unsure whether to step in or let the couple resolve it in front of everyone. Ikenna took another small breath, his eyes never leaving Ngozi's. "Please," he added, almost in a whisper, "hear me out before you decide." The guests could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The slap had been shocking, the accusation explosive, but this calm, deliberate response was somehow even more gripping. It was as if the entire room had paused, waiting for the next words to unlock the truth behind this public heartbreak. For a brief moment, the tension eased into silence, every ear straining for his explanation. But instead of rushing into it, Ikenna let the stillness linger, holding the room in the palm of his hand. Everyone knew the story wasn't over, it was only just beginning. All eyes stayed fixed on Ikenna as he finally began to speak. His voice was steady but low, forcing the crowd to lean in. "Ngozi," he said, "last night, I did leave the bachelor party early, but not for the reason you think." The murmurs in the room quieted, replaced by a tense stillness. He took a slow breath before continuing. "I went to the hospital." His words drew confused looks from the guests, but Ngozi's eyes narrowed, unsure where this was going. It wasn't another woman, he said firmly. It was your younger brother. The sentence hit her like a wave. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Enkay's gaze softened. He was in critical condition. I got a call from one of his friends. They didn't want to disturb you, but I couldn't ignore it. I went straight there. The room fell silent. A few people exchanged shocked glances. Others bowed their heads, suddenly ashamed of their earlier whispers. He was barely breathing when I arrived, Enkay went on. The doctors were doing everything they could. I stayed with him until he was stable, until I knew he was safe. Ngozi's grip on her bouquet loosened, petals slipping to the floor. Why didn't you tell me? She asked in a trembling voice. Because, he said softly, I didn't want to ruin your morning. I wanted you to wake up happy, thinking only about walking down the aisle. I thought I could tell you after the wedding, when your heart wasn't so full of nerves and pressure. Gasps and sighs moved through the church. The guests who had looked at Enkay with suspicion now stared at him with respect. Ngozi blinked rapidly, her tears spilling over. The anger in her eyes wavered, replaced by something fragile and aching. She had been ready to hate him, but now every assumption she'd made felt like a wound she'd given herself. Enkay didn't move closer, didn't push her to speak. He just let the truth settle in the air, giving her the space to feel its weight. The love he had shown her brother spoke louder than any vow. Ngozi's lips trembled as she finally found the strength to speak. Her voice was soft at first, but in the silent church, every word carried. I heard something this morning, she began, her eyes glistening with regret. One of the bridesmaids was talking to another, and I heard her say, he spent the night with someone. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. I didn't hear the rest. I didn't ask questions. I just believed it. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some exchanging guilty glances. The weight of her confession settled over the room like a thick cloud. She lifted her eyes to Enkay, her voice cracking. I didn't know they meant the nurse, the one caring for my brother. I thought, her words broke, the shame heavy in her tone. A murmur rippled through the church as the truth began to connect in everyone's minds. The careless fragment of a conversation, overheard and misunderstood, had turned into poison. I woke up with that thought burning in my head, Ngozi continued, her voice trembling. Every smile you gave me this morning, every time you held my hand, I kept thinking you were hiding something. And when I walked down the aisle and saw you smiling like nothing happened, She paused, her throat tightening. I let the anger win. Some guests lowered their eyes, others shook their heads at how quickly the rumor had taken root. The bridesmaid who had spoken the words shifted nervously in her seat, her face pale. Enkay stood quietly, letting her speak, his expression calm but filled with sadness. Ngozi's voice broke again. If I had just asked you, if I had just listened instead of assuming, none of this would have happened. The truth was now laid bare. There had been no betrayal, only a chain of misunderstanding and silence. The same love that had brought them here had almost been destroyed by a few careless words. And in that moment, every person in the room understood how fragile trust could be when it wasn't protected by communication. The weight of the truth crushed Ngozi's heart. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, the bouquet slipping from her hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks as sobs shook her body. The sound was raw, echoing through the silent church. Every guest watched, their own hearts heavy, as the once proud bride now trembled under the shame of her mistake. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. Her hands covered her face, as if hiding from the eyes that had witnessed everything. She wasn't just apologizing for the slap or the accusation. She was apologizing for not trusting the man she loved. Enkay stepped forward slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't hesitate or let pride keep him still. Gently, he reached down, his strong hands lifting her from the ground. She looked up at him, her eyes swollen and red, expecting anger or coldness. Instead, she found warmth. I understand why you doubted me, he said softly, his voice steady despite the emotions in the air. You were hurt. You were scared. And love forgives. His words wrapped around her like a blanket, melting the last of her defenses. A few guests dabbed their eyes, others looked away to hide their emotions. The tension that had gripped the church for so long began to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Ngozi's sobs slowed, but her tears didn't stop. She clung to him as if afraid to let go, her head resting against his chest. The red mark on his cheek was still there, a reminder of the moment that could have ruined them, but also a symbol of the love strong enough to survive it. Around them, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was gentle, almost sacred. In that instant, it didn't matter who was watching or what had been said. All that mattered was that they still stood together, choosing to forgive, choosing to love, even after being pushed to the edge. Ikenna kept his hands gently around Ngozi's, his eyes locked on hers as though the rest of the world had disappeared. His voice was steady but carried the weight of everything they had just been through. "Ngozi," he began, his tone raw and unshaken, "I'm not marrying you for a perfect day. I'm marrying you for a lifetime, even through misunderstandings." The words seemed to settle deep in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. His voice grew softer, but every ear strained to hear. "Today isn't perfect, but it's real. And I'd rather have real with you than perfect with anyone else. We'll fight, we'll disagree, but we'll always find our way back, because my love for you is bigger than any moment of doubt." Ngozi's tears spilled freely again, but now they were mixed with relief. Her fingers tightened around his, as if holding on to the promise with her whole being. Guests in the first row began dabbing at their eyes, some smiling through their tears. Even the priest's face softened, his lips curving into a quiet smile. The air in the church had shifted completely. Where there had been tension and suspicion, there was now warmth and unity. Ikenna lifted his hands slightly, brushing his thumbs over hers. "When I said I'd stand by you, I meant in joy and in pain, in laughter and in doubt. This moment will not break us, it will make us stronger." Ngozi let out a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I promise to trust you, to listen before I judge, and to love you in every season of our life." The guests couldn't hold back anymore. Soft sniffles and quiet sobs filled the room as handkerchiefs appeared from pockets and purses. A few people clasped their partner's hand, moved by the reminder of what true commitment meant. In that instant, the vows weren't just for the couple, they were a lesson to everyone present. Love wasn't about flawless moments, it was about surviving the storms together, holding on even when the world tried to pull you apart. The priest's voice carried gently through the church as he called for the rings. Ikenna took Ngozi's hand, sliding the band onto her finger with steady care, his eyes never leaving hers. She did the same, her fingers trembling slightly but her smile returning at last. The exchange felt different now, not just a tradition, but a quiet promise renewed after almost breaking. The moment the rings were in place, the priest announced them husband and wife. A wave of relief and joy swept through the room, and the church erupted in applause. Some guests stood, clapping through tears, while others cheered loudly, their earlier doubts washed away. The choir's voices rose again, this time carrying hope and celebration. Ikenna pulled Ngozi into a gentle embrace, their foreheads touching as they shared a private moment in the middle of the noise. No words were needed, everything they had just endured had been spoken in glances, tears, and forgiveness. As they walked back down the aisle together, hands entwined, people reached out to touch them, to congratulate them, to remind them that love had won. Cameras flashed, capturing both their smiles and the faint redness still on Ikenna's cheek, a mark that would soon become part of the story everyone would talk about. By evening, photos from the wedding began appearing online. The slap, the tense faces, the tearful vows, all of it spread across social media. Some posts were shocked, others deeply moved. Comment sections filled with strangers debating, sympathizing, and ultimately admiring the strength it took for them to stand together after such a public misunderstanding. One picture, in particular, went viral, Ikenna holding Ngozi's hands at the altar, looking at her like nothing else in the world mattered. It was paired with his words, written in bold letters, "I'm not marrying you for a perfect day. I'm marrying you for a lifetime, even through misunderstandings." The story became a reminder that love isn't tested in its easiest moments, but in its hardest. And as the last line of the most shared post read, "Sometimes, love is tested before it's celebrated."